was asked recently if I would draw a golden retriever for my Patreons. So this week I sat down and drew this gorgeous boy. In this video, I'll show you some of the techniques used. This little portrait was fairly simple and took about 5 hours to complete. I wanted to concentrate on the shapes and the contrast of the tonal values rather than the detail to bring the structure and realism to his head. I've used a mix of Caran d'Ache Luminance and Polychromos pencils to achieve a blended finish with fewer layers than I would usually use. I've used Fabriano Artistico to draw on, and there's a full-length tutorial starting over on Patreon this week if you'd like to consider joining us over there. The tutorial includes a line drawing, supply list and reference photograph, and you'll also find an ever-increasing library of tutorials. The reference photograph was taken by Mitchell Liu and is available on Unsplash. So whenever I start a portrait, I always start with the eye, as I find that it's a useful landmark for me to work out from and helps me to see some of the life in the portrait from the outset. So I'm starting by outlining the eye with a dark, sharp pencil. I'm using the dark sepia here, and I'm using the Polychromos pencil as it's quite a hard pencil, so keeps a sharp point, which is great for adding detail. From there I add colours into the eye, working from light to dark. I like to add a darker pencil towards the bottom of the eyeball, which sets the eye into the eye socket and creates the 3D ball shape of the eye. So from there I start to work out from the edge of the eye, applying the pencil in the direction of the fur. I've already applied a base layer of warm grey 1, and now I'm using the sepia 50% from the luminance range to add a darker grey area around the eye. The sepia 50% is a grey pencil, but it's got a touch of red-brown, which can sometimes look purple, and that's quite a useful colour to use here. I'm darkening around the edge of the eye with dark sepia and then black to create the depth to the eye socket. I don't often use a black pencil to create these darker areas, but as this was a portrait that I wanted to complete in a quicker time frame, I decided to just go straight in with the black as the area was quite small anyway. The section coming out away from the eye is quite an important section as it's starting to shape and form his head. And this area is one of the few areas on the portrait that's actually quite a bright area. So I use a light yellow ochre and a burnt ochre from the Polychromos to create the yellow. The Polychromos work really quite well here as they almost glaze the area, so allow the base layers to show through underneath, but just put that tint of colour that I need on top. I carry on working over the head of the dog, always adding a base layer first, always using a really light pressure for each layer, and that means that I'm only applying the pencil to the very top of the tooth of the paper, which helps me blend the pencils with subsequent layers. I remove the pencil lines as I go around the drawing. I find that the kneadable eraser is really useful to add a few highlights and pick up crumbs on the watercolor paper, and also quite good at knocking back the lines. But I go to my Tombow Mono Zero eraser if I want to completely remove the pencil lines. I want this drawing to look realistic, so I don't want a harsh, hard, dark outline on the edges, as you might find perhaps in a cartoon character, for example. I use edges that fade away on the top of his head, and also use soft transitions along with some quite hard edges to create the 3D form of the dog's head. Moving on to the nose, there's very little detail in the nose on this reference photograph. So instead I want to use the dark areas next to the light areas to create the shape of his nose rather than looking for details. This nose is actually quite a good example of demonstrating that lots of detail isn't always necessary to make something look real. I start by plotting in the darker areas with a warm grey 6, and then I add pigment from the base layers upwards, making sure that I have that contrast between the lights and darks to create the shape of the nose. I'm using the luminance pencils from Caran d'Ache as a base layer in this portrait. The pigment in the luminance pencils is very thick, it's quite opaque, and they help me fill the tooth and the graininess of the paper faster than I can perhaps achieve with the polychromos pencils. I'm using Fabriano Artistico to draw this portrait. And you may already know that Fabriano changed the texture of their paper slightly in fairly recent times. Initially, I wasn't so keen on the new textures of the paper, and I did actually go searching for an alternative. I still haven't found a paper to beat the Artistico yet, although I'm still looking. I did notice that if I use the luminance pencils as the underlayers, whereas in the past I would have perhaps used the polychromos pencils as the underlayers, I could get rid of that almost diagonal texture on the paper fairly quickly when I use the luminance pencils. The muzzle area is created by adding the underlayers first with the luminance buff titanium and the brown ochre 10%, and then adding the suggestion of these tiny little hair details with a polychromos pencil. The polychromos pencils are a really good pencil for adding these small details. It's oil based, it keeps a hard sharp tip for longer than a pencil like the Caran d'Ache Luminance or the Caran d'Ache Pablo would. I'm using the dark pencil here to draw in these little darker hairs, and this in turn is actually also creating the lighter hairs from the areas that I'm leaving. I'm keeping the darker lines more concentrated towards the bottom of his muzzle to shape and form his lips. I don't want to draw a solid outline of his lips with the dark pencil, but instead I want to use all these little fur strokes, keeping them in the direction that his face and his fur is going in, and that's going to define and shape that area. Finally, in the muzzle area, I go in with a sharp Payne's grey to define just a few more of those hairs and make the whole area look a little bit more natural. I want to make sure that the fur under his chin is in shadow, and I use the French grey pencils from the Luminance range to create the shadows here. I use the French grey pencils quite a lot when I'm drawing this sort of creamy golden coat colour. The French grey pencils are a warm grey, but they've got more of a touch of brown in them. So they've got more of a brown tint than you'd find in the warm grey pencils of the polychromos. I use the percentage French greys as well as the French grey itself. There isn't really an exact alternative in the polychromos range, but the closest match would be something like perhaps the warm grey 3 mixed with a little bit of nugget in there too. Once I've added the underlayers into the area to represent the shadows, I use the Tombow Mono Zero eraser to draw in some of the lighter fur on top of the coat. The Tombow is shaped like a pen, and it works by removing some of the pigment that has gone down, and that creates texture and depth to the coat. The Tombow I find works really well on watercolor paper, but you do need to remember that it will pick up pigment as you're erasing with it, and that will make the end of the eraser quite dirty. And once the eraser end is dirty, it will just drag pigment around the paper rather than picking it up. So you will need to clean the end of the eraser quite regularly. And I just clean it off on a piece of scrap paper, or I've got a wooden drawing board and I just rub it on the drawing board and clean it that way. Once I've added some lighter areas and texture with the Tombow eraser, I go back in and tint those areas that I've removed. I tidy them up, I add a little extra shadow and contrast to the surrounding areas to make them look like the erased areas are actually part of the fur rather than just sitting on top. So this layering and removing of the pigment process with the Tombow, I may actually go back and do that more than once. I don't just have to do that once, I can carry on adding a few more layers, and I can go back and use the eraser again to add a few more highlights, a little bit more depth, and to create more texture in the fur as I need to. Finally, once I'm happy with all the layers that I've created and the depth of the coat, I add a few stray hairs here and there with the slice tool for a little extra bit of definition. There are areas in the portrait that ended up being a little bit brighter than I initially wanted. So I used the raw umber 50% to apply to some of the areas, and that just neutralised the colour a little bit and made it a little more subtle. I carry on around the side of the dog's head, building the layers into the fur to add depth and texture. When I was looking for the reference photograph to draw this golden retriever, I was particularly drawn to this image. I just love this dog's beautiful ear and the way that it was turned out and backwards. I started, as always, by plotting in the shapes and the areas that were important first. And I used the brown ochre 10% from the luminance range to do this. After adding some of the darker layers in, I went in with a light yellow ochre to glaze and add an almost transparent touch to the brighter yellow area where I needed it. I started the underside of his ear with a warm grey 1 pencil from the Polychromos range, and then used the burnt sienna 10% from the luminance over the top to create this very muted pink colour that I wanted. I needed to make sure that there was a darker shadow at the point where the top of the ear meets the underside of the ear to illustrate that pink area going up and under the deeper part of the ear. The nugget, the warm greys, and ultimately the dark sepia were really useful here to create this shadow. And that's about it. As I say, he didn't really take that long to draw. He took about 5 hours to draw him, which for me is really quite quick compared to how long I would usually take when drawing a pet portrait. I hope that you've enjoyed this video. If you have, please give it a like, as that's a really huge help and supports the channel. If you want to see more videos, don't forget to subscribe and click on the bell so you receive a notification when the next video is available. I release videos here on YouTube regularly, at least once a week. So thanks very much for watching, and I'll see you next time.